within the green hills of Brittany, where the paths bend gently following the course of the streams, and where the mist seems to awaken with the first light of dawn, there existed a lake surrounded by ancient oaks, so old that their branches seem to have heard the secrets of kings and bards from forgotten times. The water of the lake was clear as crystal, though on cold mornings it appeared veiled in a silvery mantle that trembled beneath the light. Often the villagers who lived not far away, in small stone houses with thatched roofs, said that the place did not entirely belong to this world. Some swore they had seen, in the reflections of the water, figures that did not belong to the living, while others claimed to have heard soft songs, like a chorus rising from the very depths of the lake to the lily-covered shores. No one dared cut wood from the oaks that grew around those waters, for they were said to be sacred trees, and that every leaf falling upon the surface became a message for the lady who dwelled in the depths. The elders called that place the Path of Oaks, for they said that if one walked among its trunks in silence, the forest would respond with gentle echoes, as though guiding one's steps toward a hidden destiny. And so, wrapped in mystery and calm, that lake was both feared and revered, a boundary between the ordinary and the magical, where dreams seemed more real than waking life. In the nearby village lived a young man named Ewan, a linen weaver who spent his days working patiently at his loom, repeating the same motions as his father and grandfather before him. Ewan was not ambitious, nor did he seek riches. What he desired most was to know the secrets of the places around him, to walk the hidden paths through tall grass, and listen to the stories the wind carried from distant hills. Though his life was simple, there was within him a quiet curiosity, a gentle longing to understand the whispers of the world. At night, after spinning the last threads by the glow of the fire, he would step to the threshold of his home and gaze at the star-filled sky, wondering what mysteries the lake held, the one so often spoken of, and why the songs others claimed to hear had never reached his ears. One dawn, after dreaming of a silver river flowing through endless fields, Ewan decided to walk to the Path of Oaks. He did not go with the intention of profaning the place, but with a simple desire to listen, to observe, and to surrender himself to the calm he had always imagined. With an ash staff in hand and a woolen cloak draped over his shoulders, he set out. The damp stones of the path reflected the brightness of the morning, and each step carried him deeper into the stillness of nature. The birds barely sang, as though they too respected the sacred silence surrounding the lake. Ewan breathed slowly, taking in the scent of damp earth, the freshness of leaves, and the breeze that seemed to play with his hair. Everything invited him to move forward without haste, as if the forest itself were preparing him for what he was about to discover. The path led him to the heart of the forest, where the oaks grew taller and closer together, forming a green canopy that filtered the sunlight into golden glimmers. There, the murmur of a stream guided him to the lake's edge. The water lay still, almost motionless, like a mirror reflecting both the clouds and the treetops. Ewan sat upon a moss-covered stone, set his staff beside him, and let his gaze drift into that perfect reflection. That was when he heard it. At first he thought it was the wind among the branches, but soon he discerned a song, soft, distant, like a whisper rising from the depths of the lake. The melody held no words, yet it conveyed calm tenderness and a beauty so delicate it seemed woven from invisible threads of light. Ewan closed his eyes and let the song envelop him. Each note seemed to cradle him like a gentle river, as though time itself had paused, leaving only the music behind. When he opened his eyes, he noticed something strange. The lake's reflection no longer matched the world before him. In the water, instead of his own image, there appeared a woman clad in a blue mantle that shimmered like the moon. Her hair was long and dark, merging with the deepest waves. Her eyes were like two stars gazing at him with unfathomable serenity. He felt no fear, only a deeper calm. He understood that he stood before the Lady of the Lake, she whom the elders spoke of with reverence. She did not fully emerge from the water, nor did she break its surface. She revealed herself only within the reflection, as though the boundary between both worlds were a delicate pane of glass. The lady did not speak with words, yet Ewan understood her message within himself. She had been waiting for him. The figure of the Lady of the Lake remained in the reflection, still and serene, as if suspended between two worlds, the realm of water and that of waking life. Ewan gazed at her with reverence, not daring to move, fearing that any sudden gesture might erase her image like a breeze disperses smoke. The song continued, clearer now, as though it had chosen his heart as its place of resonance. They were not words, and yet each note awakened memories and emotions he did not know he possessed. Visions of endless meadows, of full moons reflected in quiet rivers, of hands weaving eternity with invisible threads. Without needing to ask, Ewan understood that the lady did not seek to frighten or dazzle him with power, but simply to share a moment of calm, a communion between man and the sacred. The reflection raised a hand, and though the water remained still, he felt within himself a gentle touch, like the brush of a feather. It was a silent gesture, yet filled with profound meaning, an invitation. With his heart beating slowly, in rhythm with the song, Ewan bowed his head in respect. No words left his lips, but in his mind he answered with a soft yes, like a summer breeze. The lady smiled, and in that gesture, the water shone with a silvery glow that illuminated the shore for an instant, before the image faded gently, as if it had never been there. Silence returned to the forest, but it was not empty. It was full of promise, as though the trees themselves had listened and now waited for what was to come. Ewan remained seated by the lake for a long time, trying to preserve in his memory the vision he had witnessed. The air held a special freshness, and the murmur of the water seemed different, as if it still carried an echo of that song. At last, he rose and took up his staff again. He had no intention of rushing back to the village. Something within him urged him onward, to follow the path that opened among the oaks, as though the lady had marked an invisible trail that only he could perceive. The forest lay wrapped in a soft twilight, though the midday light began to filter through in golden beams. Fallen leaves crunched beneath his steps, and now and then the wind stirred the branches, casting handfuls of dancing shadows across the ground. As he walked, Ewan felt time lose its usual hold. He could not tell how long he had been walking, perhaps minutes, perhaps hours. The path seemed endless, yet he never felt tired or uneasy. The air smelled of fresh moss, damp bark, and wildflowers growing where the light touched the ground. Around him, the distant song of a blackbird or the gentle hum of an insect completed the forest's quiet symphony. Gradually, he began to feel that his journey was not merely physical, but inward as well. With each step, scattered thoughts of his daily life faded away, worries about his work at the loom, memories of rainy days, voices of villagers. Everything dissolved like mist, leaving only the clarity of the present moment. The path, he thought, was not made only of earth and leaves. It was also a path of dreams. After a long stretch, the forest opened into a clearing. There, tall grass swayed gently in the breeze. At its center stood a circle of ancient stones, rising like silent guardians, covered in lichen and moss. Ewan stopped, filled with wonder. He had heard of that place. The elders called it the Circle of Whispers, for they said that at night the stones murmured stories of distant times, spoken by the spirits dwelling within them. He walked slowly toward the circle and placed a hand upon the cold, rough surface of one of the stones. At the touch, he felt a subtle vibration, almost imperceptible, as though the echo of thousands of ancient voices passed through him. They were not threatening voices, but soft and patient, like countless streams flowing in different directions, yet meeting within the same river. Ewan did not understand the words, if there were words at all, but he grasped their essence. Welcome. He sat upon the grass within the circle, letting the gentle sun warm his face. Closing his eyes, the murmur of the stones blended with the memory of the lady's song, forming a melody without beginning or end. In that deep calm, he slowly drifted into sleep. But it was no ordinary sleep. It was as if the forest itself cradled him, inviting him into another world, one woven of symbols, reflections, and whispers. In his dream, Ewan found himself once more at the lake's edge. The surface shimmered beneath the moon, larger and brighter than ever. Before him, the lady emerged slightly more from the water, her face radiant, her eyes infinitely deep. This time, her voice could be heard, like a whisper traveling through the stars. The path of oaks holds memories few remember. You have been called to listen, not to possess. He who listens with the heart opens doors that have no locks. Ewan bowed his head in silence. The lady extended her hands, and from them emerged a thread of silver, as fine as moonlight. It stretched toward Ewan, who received it gently. This thread, she continued, is not woven of linen or wool, but of memory and dream. Keep it within you, for each time you remember it, the path will open to you. With those words, the vision began to fade. The moon dimmed, the lake darkened, and Ewan felt himself slowly returning to waking. He opened his eyes in the clearing, still lying upon the soft grass. The sun had moved higher, bathing the circle of stones in golden light. For a moment, he wondered if it had all been a dream. But when he closed his eyes again, he could feel within himself the silver thread, invisible and luminous, vibrating with the same melody he had heard at the lake. He rose calmly, took his staff, and stood for a few moments contemplating the clearing. He felt no urgency to return, yet he knew the day was advancing, and that the villagers would soon notice his absence. The path back now seemed lighter, shorter, as though the trees themselves accompanied him with quiet benevolence. Each falling leaf seemed to shimmer for an instant before touching the ground, and every breeze carried a whisper of farewell. When at last he left the forest and glimpsed the chimneys of his village in the distance, Ewan carried within him a deep peace. He did not intend to tell what he had seen, not because he wished to keep it secret, but because he understood that each person must walk their own path, and that words could never fully contain the experience. From that day on, Each time he returned to his loom, he felt that the linen threads were reflections of that silver thread, and that, in some mysterious way, everything he wove carried a fragment of the dreams the forest had revealed to him. The weeks that followed the first encounter passed in serenity. Ewan returned to his loom with a different composure, as if each thread carried, trembling and secret, a reflection of the moon upon the water. His hands worked on their own, rhythmic and patient, and the steady beat of the loom seemed to fall into time with that wordless song the forest had gently placed deep within his chest. In the village, no one asked much, for Ewan was known for his discretion and his fondness for quiet paths. Only the old woman Mary, who sold herbs and dried flowers, and who many called the keeper of the seasons, watched him with those clear, ancient eyes that seemed to see beyond stone walls. She said nothing, merely smiled as she passed, and leaving a small bundle of water mint and heather upon his table, murmured a "for good dreams" that was closer to a breath than a voice. One afternoon, as the sun began to sink behind the green backs of the hills, a different breeze descended upon the village. It was neither cooler nor warmer, yet it carried with it the unmistakable scent of the lake, a clean, faintly sweet fragrance of reeds, elderflower, and whetstone. Ewan, who was finishing a soft, pale cloth, lifted his head. His gaze lingered for a moment on the window. Then, with the same calm with which one might set aside a tangled skein, he placed his tools in their place, took up his ash staff, and draped his cloak over his shoulders. He did not say where he was going, for there was no need. His hands knew, his feet knew, and the silver thread that pulsed faintly within him knew. He took the path that began beside the old yew in the square, where children played at stones, and within a few steps he left behind the murmur of voices, the scents of bread and washed wool, and once again entered the heart of the forest. This time, the path received him as one receives someone expected. The chestnut grove cast around him a rain of rounded shadows. The sound of his steps grew intimate, as if he were walking inside a song. The oaks formed a high, ancient vault, and here and there the light filtered through in fine lines, leaving golden dust suspended in the air. Now and then, a robin hopped among the ferns and glanced at him sideways, curious. Blackbirds let fall a brief whistle from some unseen branch. And though there was no hurry, Ewan felt himself moving with a new gentleness, as if the forest had taught him to walk without disturbing the small things. The breeze carried, very faintly, notes of a familiar song. Ewan smiled without noticing and continued walking, his eyes open and his heart open as well, to every living thing. The lake appeared as before, silent and still, a sheet of liquid silver framed by ancient oaks. Along its edge, a lapwing left a trail of pointed footprints that the water erased with tenderness. Ewan approached slowly, sensing the cool evaporation rising from the surface, and felt upon his face the faint tickle of mist. He did not need to sit. He did not need to call. It was enough to remain still and allow his senses to soften for the song to appear. At first, diffuse, then clear, like fog lifting from a valley. The melody was the same, and yet different. The same because it was made of calm, of promise. Different because, like all living water, it never repeated the same pattern. Ewan kept his gaze fixed upon the mirror of the lake. This time he did not see the lady's blue mantle, nor the shimmer of her hands. Instead, he saw something small, a little bark boat drifting across the surface, as though carried by a hidden current. The tiny vessel came out of shadow, bearing a small bundle of reeds as a sail, and its course led it straight toward the mossy stone where Ewan had sat before. The young man extended his hand. The boat touched his fingers lightly and stopped, as if recognizing him. Inside lay an object wrapped in thin linen. Ewan took it carefully, untied the knot, and found a small bone needle, polished with a long, slender eye. As he held it, a tingling ran across his palm, and the memory of the silver thread became clearer. There was also a small hazel twig, gently curved, no thicker than a finger, its bark still warm with sap. Ewan understood without need of words. These were not things to possess, but to weave into a gesture of attention, a slow knowing. He lifted his gaze, and in the reflection, glimpsed for an instant the blue shadow of the lady. Not a face, not a defined form, but the presence of a loving calm, as though someone very ancient and very patient were silently accompanying him. "Thank you," he said softly. "I will learn to listen." The little boat, now free of its burden, turned lightly and drifted away toward the part of the lake where the light was densest. The song softened like a blessing, and the air seemed to settle warmly upon the young man's shoulders. Ewan sat upon the stone. He placed the needle and the twig upon his cloak, closed his eyes, and for a while devoted himself to the most difficult and simplest task, doing nothing, only breathing, letting the forest lend him its long sense of time. When he opened his eyes again, the sun had moved along its arc and set aflame the new leaves of a nearby hazel in gold. Then he heard a familiar sound behind him, the gentle crunch of someone walking without haste. He turned and found Mary, the old herb woman, standing beneath an oak. She carried a wicker basket on her arm, and a hawthorn petal had settled in her white hair. "You have come on a good day, son," she said, without surprise. "The lake is generous, and the forest awake." Ewan inclined his head in greeting. He did not ask how she had found him. In the forest, questions follow other paths and rarely move straight. "I have received these," he said, showing her the bone needle and the hazel twig. Mary smiled with tenderness. "The needle to remember that what is fine sustains the world. The hazel to remember that wisdom does not shout. It grows in silence, like the nut from within." The old woman sat beside him with a sigh that was not of weariness, but of settling into the earth, as a stone finds its hollow. "Our elders," she continued, "knew this place by many names. Some called it the Eye of the Forest, others the Moon's Bowl. The old druids knew it as a well of memory. You have already felt it. One comes to listen, not to take. If you know how to listen, weave. If you know how to weave, sustain." Ewan received her words as one tends the fire of his home. Mary leaned forward, dipped her fingers into the water, and brushed them across his forehead as though tracing a half-moon. "Not to mark you," she said, "but so you remember the rhythm of what breathes." The wind carried from the opposite shore a faint murmur like the laughter of a distant child. The old woman fell silent and smiled, and Ewan understood that this too was part of the language of the place. "Tonight," Mary added, "if the sky clears, the circle of stones will speak. Come with the cloak you wove yesterday, the pale one. Bring also a wooden bowl, empty as it should be." She rose with an ease that did not seem of her age and walked away, without sound. Ewan gathered his gifts carefully, folded his cloak, took his staff, and followed the gentle line of the path. Within him, the silver thread shone with growing serenity. as though it were learning to breathe with the forest. Before night fell, the sky cleared of clouds, and a deep blue descended softly, as if someone had draped the world in velvet. A star appeared where the west dimmed, then another and another, until the sky became a bowl of dark granite scattered with salt. Ewan walked to the circle of whispers, with the pale cloak folded over his arm and a wooden bowl in his hand. The scent of the earth was richer in the dusk, the moss more damp, his steps slower for the sheer pleasure of slowness. He found Mary there, who had placed upon one of the stones a small sprig of hawthorn and a few embers that gave off a quiet warmth, just enough to scent the air with a trace of resin. "You arrive in time," she said, adjusting her shawl. "When the stones awaken, they do not raise their voices, you will see." Ewan sat, placing the cloak upon his lap and the wooden bowl between his hands. Mary closed her eyes and began to sing. Not a song of known words, but a simple melody, a single line rising and falling like the chest of someone asleep. The stones around them seemed to breathe with that music. A fine murmur of grain, of time, passed through the clearing. The young man felt his body settle as a log settles into a stream, without haste, allowing the water to find its angles. He saw, not with his eyes, but with something deeper, images that were and were not his own. Old hands gathering water into wooden bowls like his, faces smiling toothlessly, heads covered with dark hoods, children running around the stones, the same sky across different nights, and always in each scene, the sense that everything came and went in calm, as the seasons do. Mary opened her eyes and nodded almost imperceptibly, as if responding to an unseen greeting. "Place your bowl in the center," she whispered. Ewan obeyed. He set the bowl at the heart of the circle upon the grass and laid the pale cloak over it, fine as woven mist, and waited. A gentle breeze crossed the clearing, and as it lifted one edge of the cloth, Ewan saw that inside the bowl there was water. No one had placed it there, and yet it was there. A thin, still surface, so still that the starry sky was reflected whole within it. "The lake," said Mary, "knows where the empty vessels are. This water is not drunk to quench thirst. It is drunk to remember." Ewan did not hurry. He took the bowl with reverence, and without rising, brought it to his lips. A single sip was enough. The taste was almost nothing. A freshness that came not from the tongue, but from his back, his shoulders, the place where he had learned since childhood to carry the weight of small worries. For a moment, and the moment lasted exactly as long as it needed, the weight eased, his chest widened, his brow relaxed, and in his belly a very soft warmth kindled, like a tiny ember. The stones whispered more deeply, perhaps in contentment. Ewan returned the bowl to its place, covered the water again with the cloak, and breathed. "When you return to your loom," said the old woman, "thread the bone needle with the memory of this sip. Those who sleep with what you weave will sleep a little closer to the trees, even within stone houses. That is all, a little closeness." She spoke not of miracles, nor of gifts that opened doors at once. She spoke of proximity, of drawing the bed nearer to the forest, even from afar. And in that, there was a quiet wisdom. They remained in silence for a long while. The night, perfectly clear, seemed itself a cloak spread wide. An owl gave its deep call from an oak. The wind withdrew, as if to let them hear more clearly. At the hour when shadows grow lightest, Mary gathered her things and with a small bow departed as she had come, without sound. Ewan remained a while longer. At last he folded the cloak, carefully poured the water from the bowl at the base of one of the stones where the grass grew brightest, and set out on the path home. He walked without a lantern. He did not need one. The eyes learn. The days that followed were filled with slow, luminous work. Ewan prepared the warp with a patience that seemed endless. He threaded the bone needle with pale thread, and each time he passed it through, he remembered the clean weight of the bowl in his hands. The loom had its own song, a steady tack and tuck that repeated became music. People began to come to Ewan's house without being called. They did not come to ask. They came to be, to watch the loom, to listen to its rhythm, to drink a cup of heather infusion in silence. A young mother, worn from restless nights with her baby, sat by the doorway and for the first time in weeks remained still for half an hour. An old man whose hands trembled, like leaves, settled onto a bench and smiled with the teeth he had left. He swore that for a moment he had heard his grandmother singing to him. Ewan made no promises, offered nothing beyond his presence and his work. Yet little by little, he set aside linens, cloaks, and vests, woven with soft tones, greys and pale greens, and a strange, almost imperceptible sheen when the light touched them sideways. Those who took them spoke not of wonders, but weeks later of deeper sleep, of unhurried awakenings, of silences that did not weigh upon them. One afternoon Mary came by with her wicker basket. "They say your weavings smell like the lakeshore," she said with gentle humor. "That is a good sign." Ewan laughed softly. "Have you returned to the lake?" she asked. "I have gone," he said, "but more than that. It is as though the lake comes. Sometimes while I weave, I think I hear the melody in the thread." "You do hear it," Mary replied. "But remember, it is not yours. You are a channel." Ewan nodded with gratitude. In that reminder, there was a lightness that freed him from the temptation to claim what in truth belonged to all. As the months passed, the forest changed its attire. From the lush green of spring, it deepened into the rich green of summer, and from there into the golds of autumn. The oak leaves, which at first seemed to hold the light, began to release it little by little, in yellows that barely whispered underfoot. It was during that time, when the early morning mists lay closer to the ground, that Ewan walked once more to the shore. He carried with him oat bread and a small bowl of milk, for he had heard it was good manners to leave offerings where ancient things dwell. The lake was quieter than usual. A group of swans rested in the distance, their long necks and white stillness like a pause in the world. Ewan placed the bread and milk upon a flat stone and sat upon another, with the same care as one who listens to a forest mass. The water did not sing at once. Instead, a small ripple stirred the surface, as though a gentle creature had barely lifted its tail. Ewan sharpened his hearing. Something, he could not tell if it was fish, leaf, or memory, approached, leaving behind a trace that was both drawing and writing. "I am here," Ewan said, "to no one and to everything." The reflection of the sky widened, and upon it appeared for a moment the figure of a dark horse, its mane like drifting algae. Ewan felt no fear, though he knew well the tales of kelpies and their will to drag the unwary into the depths. Perhaps, he thought, there are creatures that approach when one carries no scent of haste or pride. The reflected horse lowered its head, a brief, elegant gesture. Ewan answered with a similar bow. The reflection vanished without sound, as though it had been part of the cloud itself. "Thank you," he murmured, not knowing to whom he spoke. Gratitude at times needs no recipient. He remained a while longer, and then, with the gentleness he had learned, poured the milk at the base of an old oak, as one waters a memory. The bread he crumbled and let fall slowly. The birds did the rest. On a grey morning, when sheep passed leaving their clean scent in the air, and a shepherd raised his staff in greeting, a stranger arrived in the village. He was a man in his 50s, wearing a long coat and a brimmed hat, his boots still muddy from the road, and his eyes attentive. He introduced himself as Rowan, a seller of dyes and threads. In his cart he carried small boxes of madder, woad, cochineal, and skeins of wool so soft they seemed like mist. Someone spoke to him of Ewan, of his pale weavings and the deep dreams they brought. The stranger came to his threshold with a kind greeting and an open manner. "I've been told," he said in a low voice, "that the loom here speaks." Ewan invited him in and offered him a cup of heather tea. Rowan set his boxes on the floor and, looking at the loom, smiled in a way that was not that of a merchant. "I've seen many looms in many villages," he said, "but I have not always seen threads that know the way back." Ewan, intrigued, looked at him as one looks at a painting whose point of view is not yet clear. "The way back to where?" he asked. "To where silence was," Rowan replied, "before we broke it with our steps." The words hung in the air, like a leaf slow to fall. Ewan understood that this man had not come merely to sell. He had also brought eyes that could recognize. "If you wish," Rowan said, and his tone was one of offering, not authority, "I can leave you some of this woad. It gives a blue like the shadow of late afternoons. And this madder, which carries the red of the earth, not to improve what you do, but because sometimes the forest also speaks in colors." Ewan accepted. That very afternoon, patiently dyed, some threads took on soft blues and pale reds. He wove them among the light gray and off-white, and without intending to, a pattern emerged, a line rising and falling, like the hills of his valley, like Mary's song over the stones. Rowan watched in silence, and when the pattern became clear, nodded. "There it is," he said. "The melody." The stranger remained in the village for a couple of days, sold his dyes, shared stories of other shores, and left as he had come, without commotion, with the certainty that some things need not be loudly named. Winter arrived without sharp edges, with brief snow in the mornings and fine frost along the edges of leaves. On some days, the lake was covered with a thin shell of ice that light turned into broken silver. The forest drew in its sounds to keep its warmth. The air smelled of peat smoke and root soups. Ewan continued weaving. He worked slowly, and winter suited him, for there is no better season to learn patience than the one in which sap sleeps deeply. At times, with his cloak over his shoulders, he would go out. He did not always walk all the way to the lake. It was enough to reach the yew in the square or the edge of the forest and look. The mist on some mornings formed islands of mild air, and crows crossed the sky like black letters of an ancient alphabet. On moonlit nights, the circle of stones spoke. Ewan, sometimes with Mary, sometimes alone, would leave the bowl outdoors, empty, and return the next day with the certainty that something unseen had filled it. There was not always water. Sometimes the bowl was dry, and yet it felt different in his hand. Those were perhaps the times when it was filled with memory. That winter, the village dreamed a little better. They did not say it that way, for villages speak in their own manner, they said. I sleep more deeply. I don't wake at every sound. I dreamed of my father and did not feel sorrow when I woke. No one spoke of the lake. There was no need. The forest has its way of passing, beneath doors. When the earliest buds began to show upon the hazel branches, and the setting sun left a brighter line upon the earth, the village celebrated the first light. Not the great feast of summer, nor the great harvest, but a small celebration, like a rehearsal, the kind that needs no calendar, because the air itself calls for it. There was sweet bread with honey, warm milk, and music in the square, violin and flute. Ewan brought one of his cloaks to the center, not to display it, but so that anyone who wished might wrap themselves for a while and rest from the gentle bustle. Children, between their running and laughter, paused for a moment to touch the cloth as one touches the back of a tame animal. Mary, wearing a crown of hawthorn and ivy, passed her hand over the fabric with the same respect one gives to the forehead of someone beloved. Good, she said. It holds. That night, when the music had quieted and the last story had been told beneath a soft moon, Ewan, already at home, felt a familiar presence. It did not smell of reeds or elderflower, but of that same round silence of the lake. It was the lady, not in form, not in reflection, but in that way winter looks toward something unseen. Ewan closed his eyes and, without knowing where the words came from, murmured, I have woven as I knew how. I have returned what I could. The harsh January air seemed to soften slightly, and sleep took him gently, with hands like water. With spring fully opened, the forest called again, this time with the unmistakable green scent of rising sap. Ewan went as one goes to a friend without needing to arrange it. The lake was alive, dotted with small circles where insects touched the surface, and lilies emerged like slender fingers. He sat upon his usual stone. He waited. Minutes lost their edges like bread fresh from the oven. The song took its time, but it did not matter. True things understand delay. When it came, it was new. No longer only a rocking. It was also a telling. Not with words, but with air. Ewan, in the hollow of his chest, understood. There was a simple rite he must learn, the last of his learning. The lady, or the lake, or the whole forest, showed him its sequence with patience, as one teaches how to braid a rope. 3 steps, none difficult, none to be dismissed. The first step, approach the shore without desire, with gratitude in the bones. The second, leave upon the stone what weighs, sorrow, unrest, weariness, in the form of a small offering. It may be a word, a piece of bread, or a memory spoken softly. The third, drink from the bowl you bring, not from the lake. A sip of your own water offered to the sky, as night offers itself to the stars, without haste, with trust. Ewan repeated the rite within himself, and knew it belonged to no one and to all. So ancient it made no noise, so simple it passed as custom. That is so, said a gentle voice behind him. It was not the lady, it was Mary, arriving with a hazel twig in hand. In the end, the old woman continued, every good rite returns you to what you already knew. It makes you remember what was never taken from you. They sat together, 2 small figures at the edge of a vast mirror. Mary placed her small piece of bread and her thanks upon the stone. Ewan placed his own unrest, small, barely more than a mischievous thread of tangled thoughts, yet his, and spoke it. Then they drank from their bowls, with the sky watching, and remained in silence for a while. When they rose, Ewan knew he had reached the end of a learning. Not of all things, for that never ends, but of this part. The silver thread within him felt at peace, as though it had finally found its loom. Life went on, as life does when water is near. Ewan wove, listened, walked. Sometimes, meeting someone in the market, it was enough to exchange a glance a moment longer, to know that the previous night's sleep had been kinder. The lake was not spoken of, it was lived. Children grew up learning, without being directly told, to respect the hazel, not to cut oak branches on a new moon, to leave crumbs at the shore on misty days. A young man who dreamed of leaving, one spring afternoon crossed the circle of stones. He sat for a while, and though his desire did not change, it ceased to burn within him, and instead began to glow like a light that accompanies. When he left months later, he did not feel he was fleeing, but going with something. Rowan, the stranger, returned once in summer, leaving dyes and taking with him a shawl that smelled of wet grass. For a sister, he said, she sleeps little. Months later, a clumsily folded letter arrived, scented with lavender. She sleeps. Thank you. Ewan smiled at the ink, as one smiles at someone entering through the door. Mary, older now, lighter, continued to come and go with her baskets. Sometimes her steps grew heavy, and Ewan would meet her halfway, gladly carrying that weight, which for him was no burden. The old woman would lean on his arm and look at the green as though it were new each time. So it is, she would say, and nothing more was needed. And the lake remained. There were coppery dawns with low mist that dimmed the world, except for that plate of silver. There were crystal middays with dragonflies tracing secret maps across the surface. There were nights of great moonlight when anyone might swear they saw at the edge a figure in a blue mantle, neither flesh nor holy water. No one said it aloud. They kept it in the same small drawer where one keeps the songs a grandfather taught without knowing how to read music. Then came, as it always does, that day of the year when the air seems to pause, as though taking breath. Ewan, who had learned the steps of his own body, knew it was time to go to the lake with his bowl and cloak. He walked with that humble solemnity of one who knows he is going to a meeting of love. That morning, the shore was strewn with freshly fallen leaves, yellow, their veins fine as lines on paper. Mushrooms had sprouted in the damp corners, and a robin accompanied him in small hops to a low stone where he placed his things. He asked for nothing. He did not bring worries like a list. He brought, as always, his attention, the most costly and most valuable thing. The water lay still, and the sky behind it was high, as if newly polished. Ewan breathed. There was no song this time. It was not needed. Instead, there was a peace that settled within him with the naturalness of a shadow at the proper hour. The silver thread, once given to him as memory and dream, vibrated with a gratitude that did not come from him, and yet passed through him. I am here, he said, and it was enough. When he stood, the little bark boat appeared again, as if it had been waiting behind some reed. It approached lightly, and Ewan extended his hand. This time inside there was no needle nor twig. There was a smooth white pebble crossed from side to side by a grey line, like the melody in his cloth. It weighed just enough. Ewan held it between his fingers. He felt its weight anchor his feet a little more firmly to the earth. He smiled. To anchor, said Mary, appearing once more as old trees do, without sound. For when the wind tries to move you from where you are well. Ewan slipped the pebble into his pocket. They remained there for a while, the water before them, the trees behind, and a future opening calmly, without haste to be seen. Then they returned to the village, with a simple sense of having done what was needed. That night, the village slept deeply, and though some woke in the middle of the night, as bodies do, they returned to sleep with the ease of a river. In many homes, the last thought before sleep was the same. Not words, not images, but a shoreline, some stones, a faint music that seemed to come from far away, and at the same time from the pillow itself. And so, in the days that followed, the valley remained a valley, the forest a forest, and the lake a lake. Ewan kept weaving slowly like one breathes, and his fabrics continued to hold quietly the tender part of life. In the circle of stones, laughter was sometimes heard, and the robin, now almost part of the family, came and went with its breast like a small ember. There are stories that close like doors. This one does not. It remains slightly ajar, not from restlessness, but so that the air may pass through. If ever you walk where the path grows soft and smells of water mint, if one morning you hear, at the rim of your cup, a faint song that does not come from the street, if in the dimness of sleep you see, in the water of your closed eyes, a line of silver rising and falling with the rhythm of your breath, remember, there are lakes that watch, there are oaks that keep, and there are hands that weave an invisible closeness between your bed and the forest. Rest, then. The world at this hour sings softly.